By the time they reached its peak in Los Angeles, the city itself seemed to be holding its breath, not in anticipation of beauty, as it so often did in the world of fashion houses and corporate empires, but in anticipation of rupture. Something in the air felt compressed, as if reality had been tightened too far and was now waiting for the smallest trigger to split it open. And at the center of that pressure was Sheila Carter. Sheila did not think of herself as someone who disrupted order. She thought of herself as someone who revealed it, because in her mind, order was never real stability. It was only temporary alignment between people who did not yet know how easily they could be separated. And Deacon Sharp, despite everything he had been to her, had become the final structure she intended to reshape. Their engagement, once framed as redemption and emotional second chance, had become something far more fragile beneath the surface. It had begun to attract attention, questions, external scrutiny, and with scrutiny came risk. Sheila did not tolerate risk when it threatened control, so she removed the source of instability. Taylor Hayes. The plan was not impulsive. It was not born in a moment of rage or jealousy. It was constructed slowly, carefully, with the precision of someone who understood that emotional systems collapse most efficiently when they believe they are still intact. The day before the engagement ceremony, Taylor disappeared. Not publicly, not dramatically, but completely enough that the absence felt unnatural the moment it occurred. At first, it was framed as uncertainty, then concern, then confusion. But when evidence began to surface, selectively placed, carefully constructed, it quickly shifted narrative direction. There were signs of departure. A personal item left behind in a way that suggested haste. A message that implied emotional conflict with Deacon. A trace of contact with someone from her past that could be interpreted as unresolved romantic history. None of it was real, but all of it was plausible. And plausibility, in emotional ecosystems, is often indistinguishable from truth when urgency overrides verification. Deacon Sharp did not process the situation as suspicion. He processed it as loss. Because everything he'd been trying to rebuild with Taylor, stability, trust, emotional clarity, had been destabilized in a single night, replaced by ambiguity that offered no direction forward. And ambiguity, when it enters a grieving emotional system, does not remain neutral. It becomes self-destructive interpretation. He searched it first, methodically, then frantically, then inconsistently, as exhaustion and emotional collapse began to erode structured thinking. Each new piece of evidence he encountered reinforced a narrative he did not want to believe but could no longer fully reject. That Taylor had chosen to leave. That she had chosen someone else. That what they had built was not as secure as he had convinced himself it was. Sheila remained beside him throughout this process, not visibly orchestrating, not directing, but present, calm, steady, the only consistent emotional anchor in a rapidly destabilizing situation. She did not push him toward conclusions. She allowed him to arrive at them. And that was always her most effective strategy, guidance that felt like realization. When Deacon began to spiral into emotional exhaustion, Sheila offered what appeared to be stability. She managed his environment, controlled access to external information, framed uncertainty as something that would resolve with time. If only he stayed close enough to the situation she was willing to define for him. And when emotional exhaustion turned into dependence, she did not correct it. She refined it. Alcohol entered the equation not as escape, but as dulling mechanism. Not introduced by Sheila directly, but facilitated through absence of interruption. Deacon's emotional system, deprived of clarity and overwhelmed by contradiction, began to seek relief in anything that reduced interpretive pressure. Sheila became both caretaker and gatekeeper, the person who defined the narrative, and the person who soothed the emotional consequences of believing it. But beneath this carefully maintained surface, something else was already moving. Taylor Hayes had not been absent. She had been contained, held in a location designed not for long-term captivity, but for psychological disorientation. Sheila did not need permanence. She needed delay. Time enough for narrative to stabilize. Time enough for Deacon's belief system to lock into place. But Taylor Hayes was not someone who accepted narrative closure without verification. Even under controlled conditions, she began to analyze patterns in timing, inconsistencies in environmental detail, behavioral anomalies in those maintaining her confinement. And slowly, carefully, she reconstructed a reality that did not match the one being presented to the outside world. Sheila had not left emotional instability to chance. She had engineered it. And once Taylor understood that, the goal of survival shifted into something more specific: exposure. Escape came not in a moment of violence, but in a moment of observation. A miscalculation in timing by those holding her. A lapse in attention created by overconfidence in the stability of the deception. Taylor did not waste the opportunity. She left quietly, not immediately returning to confrontation, but orienting herself first, physically, mentally, strategically, because she understood something critical. Sheila's power was not in physical control. It was in narrative control. And narrative control collapses only when contradiction becomes unavoidable. By the time Taylor began moving back toward Los Angeles, the engagement ceremony was already approaching its breaking point. Deacon, now emotionally isolated within a constructed reality of loss and betrayal, was preparing for an event that no longer represented celebration, but confirmation of emotional collapse. Sheila ensured she remained present in that narrative space, calming him, guiding him, preventing external influence from destabilizing what had already been carefully built. But she could not anticipate one variable returning sooner than expected. Taylor Hayes was coming back, not as victim, but as correction. The location chosen for final confrontation was not accidental. The cliffside overlooking the ocean had always held symbolic weight within their emotional histories, a place associated with revelation, turning points, irreversible decisions. It was a place where private conflict often became public consequence, where emotional truth had nowhere to hide except in exposure. Taylor arrived alone, not immediately revealing herself, observing first. She saw Deacon from a distance, emotionally unstable, visibly fractured, anchored to Sheila in a way that no longer resembled love, but dependency shaped by emotional exhaustion. And she saw Sheila, composed, controlled, watching him not as partner, but as system under maintenance. That was the moment Taylor understood the full scale of what she was dealing with. This was not simply manipulation. It was reconstruction of reality through emotional dependency. Taylor stepped forward. The wind off the cliff carried sound differently, distorting distance, making the space feel larger than it was. Sheila saw her first, and for a fraction of a second, so brief it might have been mistaken for curiosity, something shifted in Sheila's expression. Recognition, not surprise. Recognition that the timeline had collapsed earlier than planned. Deacon turned next, and in that moment, reality fractured again. Because the narrative he had been living inside, loss, abandonment, betrayal, was suddenly confronted by presence. Not memory, not suggestion, presence. Taylor did not speak immediately. Neither did Sheila. Because in moments like this, words are not tools of communication. They are weapons of sequencing. Sheila attempted to reframe first. She spoke calmly, suggesting confusion, suggesting emotional instability, suggesting that Taylor's presence was a symptom of distress rather than correction of it. But Taylor did not respond to narrative framing. She responded to structure. She named inconsistencies. She referenced medical impossibilities. She pointed out timing contradictions that no longer aligned under scrutiny. Each statement was precise. Each statement removed interpretive flexibility. And as she spoke, Deacon began to shift, not suddenly but visibly. The foundation beneath his belief system began to weaken, not because he wanted it to, but because it no longer held coherence under simultaneous narratives. Sheila felt it immediately, the loss of alignment, the beginning of destabilization. And That was when control changed form. She no longer attempted persuasion. She attempted containment. But containment requires time. And time, at that moment, was no longer hers alone. The confrontation did not remain verbal for long. Because truth, when forced into direct collision with constructed reality, does not resolve cleanly. It fractures, emotionally first, then structurally. Deacon stood between them, no longer anchored to either interpretation, caught in the space where both narratives overlapped and contradicted each other too strongly to coexist. Taylor's truth, Sheila's construction, and beneath both, his own inability to reconcile the difference quickly enough to remain stable. The wind intensified. The cliff behind them became more than setting. It became pressure. And in Sheila's eyes, something changed again. Not panic, not fear, decision. Because when control cannot be maintained through narrative, it often shifts toward finality. Taylor saw it a fraction of a second too late. The movement was subtle, but intention does not require speed to be irreversible. And in that suspended moment where truth, deception, and emotional collapse converge at the edge of the cliffside, everything that had been hidden across months of manipulation and silence reached the point where no version of reality could remain intact without consequence. What followed was no longer simply confrontation. It was collapse arriving in physical space. And at that edge, where ocean met rock and certainty no longer had ground to stand on, one final question remained unspoken across all three of them. When reality breaks this completely, who survives the truth, and who cannot? Daphne Walton had never imagined that love could feel like a narrowing corridor. At first, her marriage to Carter had been spacious in her mind, full of possibility, quiet mornings that stretched into shared futures, conversations about things that had not yet happened but already felt certain. But certainty, she was learning, was not a stable structure. It was only ever a temporary agreement between expectation and reality. And reality, in its most brutal form, had begun to close in. The absence of a child had stopped being a private disappointment and had become something heavier, something that followed her into silence. It was not simply that she could not conceive. It was that every test, every consultation, every careful reassurance from doctors began to feel like variations of the same conclusion. There was no simple explanation that would restore what she believed she was owed by fate. Carter tried to comfort her. He always tried. But even love, when it is sincere, can become inadequate when it is asked to compensate for grief that has no resolution. And so Daphne began to think in terms she had never allowed herself before. Not acceptance, not patience, but alternatives. The idea did not arrive fully formed. It emerged slowly, almost quietly, in the spaces between exhaustion and obsession. At first it was unspoken, then half-formed, then something she began to circle around mentally without fully acknowledging. And eventually, it became something she could no longer ignore. Surrogacy. The word itself felt clinical enough to contain what she could not emotionally contain on her own. A solution that did not require confession, only arrangement. A way to preserve her marriage without exposing its fracture. But there was a condition Daphne could not escape. Carter could not know. Not yet. Not until it was too late for doubt to interfere. That was how she found herself sitting across from Melissa Dillon. Melissa had already been moving through her own instability, emotional exhaustion, financial pressure, and the lingering consequences of decisions she had made in moments of vulnerability. Her life, once briefly entangled with Will Spencer, had become something she was actively trying to distance herself from, though distance in Los Angeles was never as clean as intention. When Daphne made her proposal, she did not frame it as manipulation. She framed it as opportunity, security, a way out for both of them, a future that could be constructed without the messy unpredictability of emotional negotiation. Melissa listened in silence. At first, she rejected it outright. The idea felt too invasive, too ethically unstable, too entangled with consequences she could already sense but not fully map. She had seen enough emotional systems collapse in this city to understand that nothing this complex ever remained contained. But rejection requires stability. And Melissa did not have stability. She had debt, uncertainty, and a growing desire to leave behind the emotional residue of her recent entanglements with Will Spencer, a situation that had left her more exposed than she wanted to admit. Daphne did not pressure her immediately. She did not need to, because desperation does not always respond to persuasion. Sometimes it responds to silence. And in that silence, Melissa began to imagine what escape might look like if it came with structure instead of chaos. A financial reset, a physical departure, a clean exit from a life that had begun to feel like a series of consequences she could not reverse. Still, she did not agree. Not yet, but she did not fully refuse anymore either. And that shift, the transition from refusal to consideration, was enough to begin altering the trajectory of everything that would follow. Because someone else was listening. Sheila Carter had not intended to overhear the conversation. She had simply been in the wrong place at the right time. Or perhaps, in her mind, the right place at the right time. Sheila had always believed that chance was just another word for timing that had not yet been understood. And what she heard was not just a proposal. It was leverage. Daphne's desperation was obvious. Melissa's hesitation even more so. And between them lay a structure of secrecy that was already fragile before Sheila even touched it. She did not reveal herself immediately. That was not her method. Instead, she observed, reconstructed, and then she began to intervene in the only way she ever truly preferred. Indirectly. The first message was subtle. Not an accusation, not a threat, just an awareness that someone knew more than they should. A reminder that private conversations are never truly private in a world built on overlapping surveillance of emotion and opportunity. Daphne received it first. A simple, unsettling implication that her proposal had not remained contained. That alone would have been enough to destabilize her. But Sheila did not stop there. Melissa received a different message. More personal, more precise. It referenced financial vulnerability, emotional instability, the kind of pressure points that do not need elaboration to be effective. The implication was simple. Cooperation might be safer than refusal. And beneath both messages was an unspoken truth neither woman could ignore anymore. They were no longer alone in their arrangement. Sheila had inserted herself into it. At first, Daphne tried to rationalize it. A coincidence, a misunderstanding, someone guessing too accurately. But Sheila Carter did not operate in coincidence. She operated in recognition. And recognition, once established, becomes impossible to unsee. Melissa, meanwhile, began to spiral inward. What had once been a theoretical exit strategy now felt like a corridor with no visible exit points. Every direction seemed to lead back to Sheila's awareness. Every decision felt pre-evaluated before she could even fully form it. And Sheila, sensing the emotional destabilization she had introduced, began to apply pressure more directly. Not openly, but precisely. She did not threaten exposure. She suggested inevitability. That Carter Walton, if informed in the wrong way, would interpret everything not as cooperation, but as betrayal. That Daphne's secrecy would become the primary narrative. That Melissa would be seen not as participant, but as instrument. And that instruments, in systems like this, are rarely protected when things collapse. The psychological effect was immediate, because Sheila was not introducing new information. She was reorganizing existing fear. Daphne, already emotionally strained, began to see the structure she had created from a different angle. What had seemed like control now looked like exposure risk. What had seemed like solution now looked like liability. And Melissa, already unstable, began to understand that her position in this arrangement was not neutral. It was exposed. Sheila did not demand payment at first. She waited until both women had reached the point where silence itself felt dangerous. Only then did she act. Her demand was not simply financial. It was behavioral, compliance, information flow, access, She was no longer just observing the situation. She was embedding herself within it. And the most dangerous part was not that she was interfering. It was that she was now shaping outcomes without appearing to do so. Daphne, caught between desperation and fear, began to reconsider whether her original plan was still viable. The idea of surrogacy, once framed as control over uncertainty, now felt like an entry point into exposure she could not manage. Melissa, meanwhile, found herself trapped in a psychological triangle where every option carried equal risk. Refusal meant instability. Acceptance meant entanglement. Escape meant visibility. And Sheila ensured that no version of movement felt safe. Because safety, in Sheila's worldview, was not something others were allowed to possess independently. It was something she distributed, or withheld. Carter remained unaware of the full scope of what was unfolding around him. And that ignorance, more than anything else, created the most dangerous imbalance of all. Because while he continued to believe he was navigating a fragile but contained emotional situation with Daphne, the reality had already expanded into something far more complex, an interconnected system of secrecy, coercion, and psychological leverage that now included forces he had no awareness of. Melissa stood at the center of that system's most unstable point. Daphne stood at its origin, and Sheila stood outside it, guiding pressure through invisible channels. The question was no longer whether the arrangement would proceed. It was how many fractures would occur before it collapsed, and whether, when it finally did, anyone inside it would still